Hello again. Our training group workshop on Monday was about the performance management chart in TrainingPeaks, which is similar to the fitness and form and freshness chart in Strava. They both work much the same. And one of the things that came up was how to use the chart or the ideas with the chart to plan and track recoveries. So those recoveries might be from a hard training session, one really hard training session, a block of a few weeks of hard training, or a big event that you've trained for and tapered for and then done the event, and then you've got to recover before you start your next block of training. So or maybe any other scenarios. It's really just a case of how you use the ideas within the chart to plan or track recovery. I find the chart to be quite useful, the chronic training load, the acute training load, and the training stress balance and the training stress scores of each training session or block of training sessions, but they're certainly not the be-all and end-all because they don't know about the other stresses that are in your life. There are other shortfalls in the way the PMC works. The performance management chart is often called the PMC. For instance, if you do a very long session that's close to your limit of endurance, it doesn't really take account of the fact that that's a lot harder than doing shorter sessions. It's proportionally harder to do. So you do say 6 hours is your limit for endurance, and 3 hours you're fairly comfortable at. If you do 3 hours and then do another 3-hour training session a couple of days later, you might be recovered in another couple of days. But if you do a 6-hour session, it might take you a week or so to recover from that before you're actually back to normal training, if you're really pushing the limits. And I know a lot of you are ultra endurance cyclists, so rather than 3 and 6 hours, it might be 6 and 12 hours or something like that, or even longer. But you get what I mean. It just assumes that duration is a linear load. So if you're at 70% of your FTP for 3 hours, that's half of the training load of 70% of your FTP for 6 hours. And that's not the case. As you get closer to your limit, it becomes increasingly proportionally harder. And then at the other end of the spectrum, some really high intensity efforts, particularly if you're an explosive sort of athlete, if you can really sprint really hard and exhaust yourself in a few seconds, then you can get very tired by just doing 6 by a minute with plenty of recovery. Whereas the training stress score that would be allocated to that by TrainingPeaks or probably by Strava isn't very much. And similarly, strength workouts, you don't build your aerobic fitness with strength workouts, but you do make yourself tired. You can do yourself create a lot of fatigue from a strength workout, and even a long walk. You won't build your aerobic fitness, but you might actually get quite a big TSS. So it sort of doesn't work. It's sort of not working the other way in that respect. So therefore, things need to be taken in context. If you're doing similar training, similar peripheral activities all the time, then it works reasonably well. If you keep changing things, like you go from the summer going outside, doing a lot of volume outside, to the winter doing a lot of more high intensity stuff inside on the trainer, then that transition period can be quite dangerous. You can get quite tired if you do a lot of high intensity work and you're not used to it. So there are 3 things you can use. The training stress balance. I prefer training stress balance to form, which is the other term used by both Strava and TrainingPeaks. I prefer the original terms that were used by Coggan and Allen in Training and Racing with a power meter, which is a really good book and worth a read, and it gives you the background of all these numbers. What you can use is have a guide, a rule of thumb. Once the training stress balance gets below a certain number, like -15 or something, you could say, well, that's a good indication that maybe I need to back off. And these numbers are specific too, so it might be -10 for some people. For me, you're sort of below -10. If I try and sustain below -10 for a long period of time, then that can be a problem. Some people can sustain a much lower value. The negative number is also dependent on the absolute number of your chronic training load. Like you might sustain -10 or -15 for a long period of time if your CTL, chronic training load, or fitness number is 40 and you're used to doing 60, but you might struggle to do -10 for any length of time if your CTL is 70 and you're used to doing 60, because the absolute value is also very important in what you can manage. And then there's the ramp rate. So the ramp rate is the change in the chronic training load over a period of time. So it might be 5 TSS per day per week, so that's over a week, or it might be 15 TSS per day per month, and those might be sustainable values. If you're building up, then 5 TSS per day per week. Building your CTL up by 5 a week can be quite good. Do 3 weeks of building up by 5 a week, and then dropping off for a recovery week and then building up again. That's quite a good way to build volume once you start after your end of season break or something like that, because you can stand quite a fast build up after a break, because your chronic training load, the absolute value of chronic training load, is a bit lower than you're used to sustaining because you've had a break. And later on you'll probably want to bring it down, or if you're a bit older you might not be able to sustain such a big gradient of such a big ramp rate. And also the absolute number of the chronic training load, the fitness number itself, can be quite useful. So if you, like, a 70 is quite a good number. If you work full time, you've got other activities going on, you manage to train 5 or 6 times a week, then you can probably sustain a CTL of 70. But if you've only managed 50 before, then you might get up to 70, but you might not be able to sustain it for very long. So having that number in mind, like maybe 5% higher or 10% higher than you've done the previous year, and using that as a guide, as a maximum number for a while, see whether you can sustain that, back it off a bit, and then see if you can get back to it and sustain it for a bit longer, is a useful way of planning your recoveries and planning the amount of training volume that you can manage. But it's also important to bring in other factors like how you feel, how do your legs feel? Are you feeling recovered? What is your heart rate variability a good guide for you? So if you track that over time, is it useful for you? A lot of things nowadays, like the Garmin, they track it automatically overnight, and you can use the trends in the overnight values to get a feel for how well you recovered or whether things are going downhill or not. After a big event or a big practice event or a few weeks of hard training, it's good to track the recovery with a few objective and subjective metrics. So first of all, you might start by doing, if you say you've done a big bikepacking event or a long Audax, you might start by doing a few easy rides, see how you feel during the easy rides. Can you sustain your zone 2, your endurance zone, with a similar perceived exertion to what you normally do? And that's a reasonable guide. And you usually after a very long event, your TSB, your form factor, will get very positive before you properly recovered. So it might be like 20 or 30, because it takes longer than the performance management chart thinks it does to recover from a really big event. So these predictive numbers, you just have to take with a pinch of salt. And then if you feel recovered on your endurance ride, try a few short efforts, because it's the high intensities that usually come back a bit slower than the low intensity. You can usually manage sort of endurance training sessions, but you'd struggle to put the power down, run a bit faster or sprint and things like that. You start to feel it in your legs. And then once that starts to work, you're okay. You can try a longer effort, see whether you can sustain an effort. Because sometimes you can sprint, but you can't sustain a power for a certain time or sustain a speed for a certain time. Try that next. Then try a formal structured training session, something you've been doing before, your big event before, the thing you're trying to recover from. If you can manage that, then you could start to assume that you're back to normal and resume normal training. But even with all that, what I find the best way to use the performance management chart and the Strava fitness freshness form chart for is as a guide, to observe what is happening, plan independently of that, and see how the numbers stack up. So what I do is I try and plan. I plan in recovery periods, and then use the numbers along with the objective and subjective metrics to get a feel for how that recovery is going, to see whether things are actually going to plan, rather than use the PMC to drive the plan. I use the plan to drive the training, and use the PMC as a guide to understand how things are feeling, as just an additional piece of data. It's a subtle difference, but it's an important difference. Anyway, I hope that's useful, and let me know. Please share this video with people you think you might find it useful, and I'll see you next time. Bye.